Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. Well, a geopolitical shift is taking place in West Asia, aka the Middle East, and Trump's visit to Saudi Arabia appears to be at the core of it. Paul, as always, I want to thank you for being a part of this discussion, and there are some changes underlying that could have some massive ramifications for what's going on in geopolitics.
Yeah, well, thanks for joining. First off, pleasure as ever. Yeah, this is relates to the sort of interesting stories and claims doing the rounds. And I know for a lot of people it will sound absolutely unreal and unbelievable, and seeing's believing, and we share that sentiment. I'm not suggesting what we're about to discuss is set in stone, but some of things have factually absolutely happened, and we're going to discuss those. But this really, as much as anything, relates to the United States' relationship with Israel. We know for decades, ever since the inception of Israel, they've had a very strong alliance. This is a statement of fact. But there seems to be increasing evidence, or at least suggestions, particularly with the Trump administration and Trump himself, that his relationship, or the claim is his relationship with Netanyahu's deteriorating, and deteriorating to the point that the United States seems to now be making or about to make policy initiatives, meaning they're effectively cutting Israel out the loop, that will have, as Ken rightly says, pretty seismic implications for West Asia in general. But of course, there are reasons for why, and we're going to assess what we think the reasons are for Trump's change of heart, or his administration's apparent change of heart, what that could mean in the future, and why the United States, as much as anything, is changing its attitude, if it is, because it needs to have reconciliation with the nations in the region. The relationship between the US and the Gulf countries has been deteriorating for quite some time, because of differences in opinion about how to treat the situation with Iran, for example, but also because they have a very different relationship with China and Russia, and their integration more and more into the multipolar world. And where we've talked about this, the US increasingly has seemed to be becoming more and more isolated in terms of its influence, or its situation in a broader sense, in West Asia, stroke the Middle East. So the US needs huge investment going forward. They need Chinese investment. That whether that happens or not remains to be seen. But they think, well, we'd like to go and have discussions with the Saudis. Trump's arrived. He's talking to MBS and other Saudi officials. And as much as anything, part of that's going to want to cement the idea, well, Saudi's prepared to invest heavily in the United States. It's prepared to want to develop projects with the United States. But Saudi Arabia, of course, on that basis, is going to say, well, okay, what's in it for us in terms of this relationship? And Saudi Arabia wants some small stability in the Middle East. And part of that stability, of course, is their ongoing statement they've made for a very long time, that they want to see the creation of a Palestinian state. They favour a so-called two-state solution, with the Israeli state existing in harmony next to Palestine. And there are people who say that can't happen, but we're not here to debate whether that can or cannot happen. That's the Israeli position. And, the Saudis' position. And therefore, on that basis, the United States is having to reflect upon the fact that Saudi's going to make a number of stipulations, likely in terms of the future of relations between the two countries, and that will include Iran, because Saudi and Iran have rapprochement. They have very increasingly strong relations in terms of wanting to work together and cooperate. And we spoke about this years before it happened, saying it was happening. People didn't believe us, and then it came out into the public domain that that is indeed the case. And the United States has had strained relations with the with the Iranians for a very long time. And that's something that needs to be resolved. And that will be part of the equation as well. So for the US, they're having to make an assessment. Okay, if we want to change relations with countries in the region, then we're going to probably have to change our attitudes, have a different perspective on relations with the likes of Iran. Okay, none of this is set in stone. We're not saying it's a statement of fact. We're just assessing things that are happening, things that are possibly happening that tend to give an indication that perhaps relations between the United States and obviously Israel, as things stand, are changing. And I think a lot of that relates to Netanyahu himself, as far as Trump's concerned, and we'll assess some of the claims made about the status of that relationship on a personal level between the two of them.
The geopolitical shift that's taking place in West Asia isn't just since Trump took over. Just a short time ago, a few years back, we had Saudi Arabia actually uh, reconnecting with Tehran, and the long-standing Shia Sunni back and forth that was for decades, finally came to a head, and there was looking at partnerships and recognition, and then of course bringing Syria when Assad was still there out from the cold into it. And there's even talk when Trump goes to Qatar or the UAE, one of the two places, that a number of different West Asian leaders are going to meet there, and allegedly Syria is going to send a diplomat. So Syria may, after all of the chaos that took place, just a few months ago, they may be integrating into what West Asia is wanting to emerge into. And a lot of these recognitions, you talk about what Trump did overnight for the Houthis. There is, in the fourth meeting, supposedly some real breakthroughs that are taking place between the Trump administration and Iran, where before this even got started, it was almost like a non-starter from the beginning. So I think there are a lot of uh, give and take that's taking place, and both sides, across the board in West Asia, are willing to make concessions as long as it's more of a peaceful and trying to eliminate a lot of the conflicts that have just stemmed up for decades in the region.
Yeah, I mean it's such a complex subject given all the problems, but yeah, with regards to the Houthis, it's a statement of fact. They reached a ceasefire agreement with the United States. Both sides agreed they'd stop bombing each other and or trying to shell ships, and the US would stop bombing Yemen. And interestingly, as part of that equation, the Israel was cut out of it. There was no discussion with the Israelis about this. It doesn't seem as though this ceasefire includes Israel. So that was a very, very telling statement of intent by the United States to effectively cut out Israel out of that equation. The subject, yes, that I mean, there is noises coming out that the talks between Iran and the United States have been more successful recently. Okay, I still think there are some major problems to negotiate, but the US position is we don't want you to have nuclear weapons, and Iran's position is we don't want nuclear weapons. But if we keep being threatened and threatened with potential war, then we have a right to defend ourselves. So if you threaten us, then we might want to manufacture nuclear weapons. I mean, it's one of those things that could be easily resolved. Now, there is a long way to go, and let's not make any assumptions that the US Iranian relations are going to be normalized or change overnight. That's ridiculous to say that. But there are encouraging signs of a change. So we have to factor that also into the equation. And once again, these talks between the Syrians and the Iranians has rather cut Israel out the loop as well. Now, with regards to the issue of Gaza, there is claims and statements that the United States wants to be part of reconstruction, but it wants to get the likes of the Saudis involved. Now, of course, for Saudi to get involved again, they're going to say, okay, well, there is considerable geopolitical risk for us to do that. So we're going to do that. What are you going to do for us, United States? So if that happens, again, that would seemingly cut Israel out of the equation. There's talk of having Palestinian governance in the future in Gaza. Now, that's a very complicated subject, and we're not going to get into it because it's just too difficult to interpret what that means and what, ultimately in a Palestinian state, if it exists, who's going to form governance. But there is talk about that. Again, it appears as though, from the US perspective, they're cutting Israel out of that equation as well. So when you start to stack all these things up, if indeed this is all indeed the case, then it would appear as though there is a big change happening in relations between the United States and West Asia, but also between the United States and Israel. Now, this might just be a personal issue that's changing Trump's mind with regards to Israel because of Netanyahu. Now, of course, the question is there going in a future election, will Netanyahu lose and will there be a different governance structure in Israel? I know a lot of people will think, well, it won't make any difference. Well, it might make a difference. And we're not here to make affirmative statements in that regard one way or other. We're just laying out what might be a thought process. And if there's a change of government, the US might then change its attitude towards effectively seemingly wanting to make decisions, but cutting, obviously, or seemingly cutting the Israelis out the equation. Now, there is claims, and thus far it seems to be the case, that on this trip, this Gulf trip to the United States, Trump is not planning on visiting Israel. Now, if that is indeed the case and doesn't happen, that is a huge statement of intent and would give some credence and support to what we're saying as well. So when you look at all these various things that are apparently happening, you can't help but think there's a change of attitude. Now, of course, the claim, and this is public domain stuff, is the fact that relations between Trump and Netanyahu were strained because Trump thinks that Netanyahu, this is the allegation anyway, is trying to push him around, trying to make him do whatever Netanyahu wants to do, basically trying to order the US president around. Now, and Trump's furious about this and is refusing to accept that that's going to happen or is, a possibility. So that therefore could be the principal reason for the strain in relations between the two. So when you add all those things up, there's definitely a clear indication that it's in the US interests to normalize relations with, normalize is the wrong word initially, but resolve clear differences with the Iranians, to have reconciliation with the Saudis. But given one of the major statements from the Saudis is they want a Palestinian state, well, if that's the case, then the United States, and there are rumors, and I stress rumors, that the United States is willing in the future to accept the existence of a Palestinian state. If that is indeed true, that is seismic. But the other thing is, in part of these kind of discussions between the United States and Saudi, there's always been talk, well, Saudi can have access to civilian nuclear technology, etc. But this is tied in with Saudi normalizing relations with Israel, Well, apparently that's no longer a precondition for Saudi to have, civilian nuclear technology. That if that's an announcement that comes out, we'll know in a few days, or maybe even a day or two. Again, that's a huge statement of intent and would support the discussions we're having. So, it's one of these things people will indeed find it impossible to believe. They'll think it's absolute nonsense, and I understand why. But there are certain things that have already happened that are factually uh, the case. There are things we will know in the next few days whether they indeed support this perspective, but it might be that there is a big seismic shift in relations between the United States and Israel, and that I think alone is makes this worthy of our discussion and attention.
There's another side point because we're looking at the overall geopolitical changes that are taking place, and something that went under the radar just a day or two ago is that in Syria, the Kurds are dismantling their militia. And it looks like the long-standing conflict between Turkey and the Kurds may quickly be coming to an end. And Turkey, of course, is one of those countries with their government leadership who has wanted to have a strong presence in what the future of West Asia is going to be. The same thing with MBS is he doesn't want to dominate, but he wants to have a position of leadership. And it's interesting that the U.S. goes to Saudi Arabia with the expectation of if we get you on board, then you are going to go ahead and get a number of these other nations on board because you're the strongest, really the strongest power of that coalition. And it feeds into MBS what he wants. It feeds into, allegedly there was just some deals that were signed by Trump just a few hours ago in Saudi Arabia for hundreds of billions of dollars. So investment's going to go into the U.S., which is something he wants to have happen. And Saudi Arabia, because of their growing uh, partnership, or I should say friendship with Iran, Saudi could be the main mediator and go-between that could bring both the United States and Iran, into the fold. And then, of course, if that happens, you start seeing the domino effect across all West Asia. And you just have to wonder, is it going to bring a lasting peace to the region and a sign of prosperity?
Well, yes, absolutely. And I just would make a final point that there is claims as well that Trump's been trying to scale back members of his administration's relationship and how they conduct themselves with Israel directly. That could also be part of this broader assessment as to what's going on. So we'll see what happens, what unfolds. But we are in a paradigm shift, and it's possible the United States will change its position on the world stage in terms of its relationships, existing ones, and it's worth discussing them accordingly. But don't rule anything out. But equally, we're not making assumptions. We're not saying, well, it's very clear this is going to happen, but there is increasing evidence that points to this. But at the end of the day, the proof of the pudding's in the eating. So we'll see what unfolds. And I think this Gulf visit by Trump will be very, very interesting in terms of what agreements are reached, what's signed, but more importantly, I think, what does Trump publicly say? And perhaps even more so, what does Trump not publicly say?
Absolutely. Well, Paul, as always, I want to thank you for your insight and for being a part of this discussion.
Yes, and likewise.
And to everybody here at the Sirius Report community, thank you as always for your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.